He thought it was just another rainy night, another quiet visit to the diner. But when a mysterious woman walked in, drenched, lost, and completely out of place, his life took a turn he never expected. A simple act of kindness led to something deeper. But what happens when the truth comes out, when secrets unravel and identities are revealed? Will their connection survive? Or was it all just an illusion? Rain poured down heavily, soaking the streets and making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. The small diner on the corner stood out like a warm beacon in the cold, wet night. Inside, the lights glowed softly, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sound of the jukebox playing an old tune. It was a quiet night, with only a few regular customers sitting at their usual spots. John sat at the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He had just finished a long day at the garage fixing cars and handling customers who needed their vehicles in a hurry. His hands were rough, his clothes smelled of grease, and he was tired, but this little diner was his escape. It was where he could sit quietly and let the world slow down for a bit. The door opened with a jingle, and a woman ushed in. She was drenched, her coat dripping water onto the floor. She looked around nervously, her damp hair sticking to her face. After a moment, she made her way to a booth in the corner and sat down. John noticed her immediately. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a small town diner. Her coat was fancy, her boots shiny, and her movements had a certain grace to them. But what really caught his attention was the look on her face. She seemed worried, almost like she was carrying a heavy burden. The waitress approached her table and handed her a menu. John tried not to stare and focus on his coffee, but he couldn't help overhearing their conversation. A few minutes later, I think I forgot my wallet, the woman said, her voice low and filled with embarrassment. I'm so sorry, I didn't realize The waitress gave her a kind smile, but John could tell the woman was deeply uncomfortable. Her cheeks turned red as she continued searching her bag, hoping to find something. John set his coffee down and made a quick decision. He waved the waitress over and handed her a few crumpled bills. I'll cover it, he said simply. The waitress looked surprised. You sure? She asked. and nodded. Yeah, it's not a big deal. The woman looked up, clearly startled. Oh no, please, she said quickly. You don't have to do that, it's fine, John replied, giving her a small smile. Everyone forgets things sometimes. She paused and smiled back, a small, grateful smile that lit up her face. Thank you, she said softly. You didn't have to, but thank you. John shrugged and went back to his coffee, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. Helping people came easily to him, and he wasn't looking for attention or thanks. The woman finished her meal quietly, and when she was done, she stood up and walked over to him. Thanks again, she said, pulling a napkin out of the dispenser on the counter. She wrote something on it and put it in front of him. Here's my number, I'd like to repay you somehow. John looked at the napkin, surprised. That's not necessary, he said honestly. It was just a meal, maybe, she said, her smile growing a little shy. But it meant more than you know. Call me sometime. And with that, she left, the bell above the door jingling softly. As she stepped out into the rain, John picked up the napkin and read her name, Natasha, followed by her phone number. He smiled to himself, wondering who this mysterious woman was and why their brief encounter felt so significant. Over the next few weeks, John and Natasha got to know each other better. It started with a phone call, then a coffee date, and soon they were meeting regularly. Natasha was warm and easy to talk to, and Jan found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. He told her about his life as a mechanic, his struggles with money, and his dream of one day starting his own garage. Natasha listened intently, always encouraging him. She shared bits of her life, too, though she was careful not to reveal too much. She told Jen she worked in business, but avoided details. She wanted to keep things simple and normal. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone cared about her for who she was, not for her wealth or status. But Natasha had a big secret. She wasn't just an ordinary woman. She was a billionaire CEO running a successful company that often made headlines. She had spent years being treated differently because of her money, and she was terrified that telling John the truth would ruin everything. She didn't want him to see her as a rich CEO. She wanted him to see her as Natasha, the woman he met on a rainy night in a small diner. The truth came out one afternoon when John decided to surprise Natasha. He stopped by her apartment with her favorite coffee in hand. The door was slightly open, so he stepped inside. Calling her name, what he saw made him freeze. The apartment was huge and full of expensive furniture. There was a shiny piece of art on the coffee table, on the top of a magazine with Natasha's picture. It said, Natasha Klein, the billionaire CEO who's changing the game. John looked at the magazine with his mind racing to the woman he was in love with. He didn't know about something very important in her life. He held the magazine in his hand when Natasha walked into the room. She softly told John, "I can explain." John looked at her with a confused and hurt look on his face. "Explain what that you've been lying to me this whole time." Natasha quickly replied, "I wasn't lying. I just didn't want my money to get in the way. I was afraid you'd see me differently. You didn't trust me. John, you thought I cared more about your money than you," he asked in a low voice. Natasha said with tears in her eyes, "I just wanted us to feel real. I didn't know how to tell you." John shook his head, his feelings getting the best of him. "I thought I knew you, Natasha, but now I'm not so sure," he said, setting down the magazine and walking out the door. Natasha standing by herself with tears running down her face. For days, Jin couldn't stop thinking about Natasha. He felt betrayed, but he also missed her greatly despite everything. He couldn't deny the connection they had one evening as he sat alone in his small apartment. He found a letter in his mailbox. It was from Natasha. In the letter, she poured out her heart. She explained how lonely her life had been and how much she feared being judged for her wealth. She wrote about how much she cared for John and how sorry she was for not telling him the truth sooner. "I fell in love with you," John, the letter read, "because you see me for who I am, not what I have. I just hope you can forgive me." John read the letter over and over, each word easing his anger. He realized Natasha had been scared just like he was. Maybe they both needed to let go of their fears. A few days later, John heard about a gala Natasha was hosting. He decided to go borrowing a suit from a friend. When he arrived, the grand hall was filled with elegantly dressed people. Chandeliers sparkling overhead. He spotted Natasha standing alone in a corner looking far away, and sad. Jan took a deep breath and walked up to her. "Natasha," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "John," she whispered, "I've been thinking." He said, "I was angry, but I realized I wasn't fair to you either. I let my pride get in the way. I don't care about your money. I care about you." Tears welled up in Natasha's eyes. "You mean that?" she asked. "Yes," and said, "I just want us to